Next question comes from Preston Peachy.
In 2001, Larissa Barrett said, over 35 years after the 1967 constitutional amendment, Indigenous people are still the most socio-economically disadvantaged within Australian society and are still vulnerable to systemic discriminatory practices. Is constitutional recognition of Indigenous people another gesture that offers no real benefit to approximately 2.5% of the national populace that are the most socio-economically disadvantaged? How does constitutional recognition improve people's quality of life?
Marcia Langton.
Preston, I believe your name is. There's a great deal of evidence that shows that racial abuse and vilification has deleterious health effects. You should read the work of Yin Paradies and other scholars on this, and the exclusion of Aboriginal people from the Constitution from 1901 till the referendum of 1967 was one of those trajectories in Australian history that amounted to sustained racial vilification of Aboriginal people for that period of time, and arguably fed into the racism that was practiced everywhere in society and excluded Aboriginal people from housing, from the economy, from schools, from universities, thus leading to more and more disadvantage. I'm firmly of the view that the right kind of referendum question that recognises the First Peoples and prevents the Commonwealth from discriminating against us would do a great deal to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. It would not be a silver bullet. It would not happen immediately, but it would happen over time, just as the 1967 referendum, the Act of Reconciliation, the apology, and so many other events in our history have had a wonderful effect in healing the nation on our side and on the non-Indigenous side, overcoming racism and making the lives of Indigenous Australians slowly, step by step, a little better.
Marcia, what Greg Craven calls the con-cons, the constitutional conservatives, could apparently kill the referendum stone dead. That's Greg Craven's analysis. One of the issues is the Commonwealth races power to make laws based on people's race, and there are fears that whatever they're replaced with could end up being a kind of quasi-Bill of Rights. That seems to be an emerging argument from these con-cons. What do you say to that?
I've listened to all of those arguments, of course not directly from Professor Craven, and I would love to hear him speak publicly on the issue so that I can fully apprehend his arguments. I can see part of the argument. The part of the argument that I understand...
I think he favours the change, by the way.
Yes.
But he's just warning that there are these problems.
Well, there are some technical issues, and I am not a constitutional lawyer, and he is one of Australia's greats, so I'm not going to have an argument with him. But just to say that there is a problem with, say, for instance, removing the race power, and then, you know, how does the Parliament have the power to make laws for the people of any race? That it would invalidate that. So there are consequences of removing the race power, and so therefore that provision that provides for the Parliament to make laws for the people of any race would have to be replaced. And of course, I was a member of the expert panel. Our proposition was that it be replaced with that section 5126 be replaced with a provision that has a short preamble, so it's not a preamble to the Constitution, and a statement of recognition. And then perhaps, you know, if Professor Craven has a strong argument for protecting the right of Indigenous people to be treated like all other citizens are, he perhaps has a better way of doing it, a less wordy way of doing it. And I think a lot of people would be very interested in hearing what he has to say.
Let's actually hear
I can't be conclusive about it, but I stand by the expert panel's report in its intention. It was not intended as a Bill of Rights, but really our Section 5126 proposition is an answer to that technical problem.
Let's hear from the Attorney-General. You'll have to struggle with this, these opposition movements, if you like, to any change, but I think you would like to see change.
Well, it's certainly one of the government's policies, and it's a bipartisan endeavour, this, to make appropriate recognition of Indigenous people in the Constitution. And Sarah, I detected in your question a little scepticism. Can I just make the point to you that I think in this area of policy, outcomes, of course, are important. Symbolism is also important. And I think sometimes people from both sides of politics have got it wrong because they've stressed the symbolism at the expense of the practical outcomes, or they've concentrated only on practical outcomes and ignored the power of symbolism. So I think we need both.
Do you see a way of dealing with the objections of these Conservatives?
Yes, I do. And I, by the way, share Greg Craven's view that this will be won or lost depending on whether Conservative Australians, who are just as entitled to their views as every other Australian, are sufficiently reassured that this doesn't constitute the sort of radical change to the Constitution that they would never be prepared to embrace. And the answer is, I think myself, and I've said this often, that only a minimalist proposal is likely to give Conservative people that level of assurance, and therefore a minimalist proposal is the proposal that I would like to see the government go forward. Now, as to the and might I remind you, Professor Langton, your expert panel actually said that no referendum question should in fact be put unless there was a sufficient degree of assurance that it was likely to succeed. So that's my answer to your question. As to the actual words, they are being developed by a parliamentary committee chaired by Ken Wyatt, the first Indigenous member of the House of Representatives, and conducted in a bipartisan fashion at the moment.
So you're confident, incidentally, that this will be prepared in time for the next election?
The Prime Minister wants the draft words settled upon before the end of this year.
Lisa Wilkinson.
The fact that Indigenous Australia is not represented in the Constitution at the moment takes my breath away. But it also takes my breath away that it was only in 1967 that Aborigines got the vote. So we have a lot of making up to do, and the sooner that happens, the more comfortable I would be.
We've got another question.